We did this fun activity where we asked Gemini to come up with a taxonomy of moral frameworks, and then we slowly kept giving Gemini criteria for what we should get rid of. We kind of kept pointing out either scientific facts or logical takeaways, and we've been eliminating. I do want to get a sense of the taxonomy of moral frameworks here. All right, here's a broadened taxonomy of moral frameworks related to the nature of moral judgment and the source of moral knowledge, moral epistemology. All right, non-cognitive frameworks. These views generally hold that moral statements do not express beliefs or propositions that can be true or false. Instead, they express attitudes, emotions, or commands. All right, so moral emotivism, the view that moral judgments are expressions of emotional attitudes. For example, saying stealing is wrong is essentially saying boo to stealing, or, you shouldn't steal. It denies that moral claims state facts. Okay, moral prescriptivism. Okay, never mind. This, I guess, emotivism is just, it's very difficult to figure out the line in between these two, but I guess moral prescriptivism is what I just said, a step beyond emotivism. It argues that moral judgments are not just emotional outbursts. So it's not just like, this is literally saying boo to stealing. Stealing is wrong. I don't like stealing. I don't like that it happens. But implicit commands or universalizable prescriptions. Stealing is wrong means do not steal. So I don't think that there's a way to get one of these without the other. I think you have to get both if you're going to do it. Moral expressivism, a more sophisticated descendant of emotivism. It suggests that moral language functions to express a complex state of mind, plans, commitments, or acceptance of norms, rather than to describe the world. Yet it mimics descriptive language in its grammar. Okay. This is great because this now is connecting the semantic and the normative. So whether something is wrong in some objective sense is highly coupled with the norms about it, like whether or not you ought to do it. Like the fact that something is wrong implies that one not do it, like conceptually so. And so Hegel would give this, or at least Brandon would give this 2 thumbs up, I think. Like this seems to be the most robust of the 3 that we've just discussed. In terms of like a philosophical sense, it seems to pack more of a punch. And as we describe in the document, like you can easily tie in this idea of norms and prescription to the underlying science of conditioning and internalizing, memory formation, pattern recognition, predictive processing, etc. It's actually doing like all of these things. I'm stating what I believe to be a fact about the world. I'm inherently in that. I'm pointing out my own thoughts about that action, and I'm also prescribing, or at least you could get all that with this. Like this allows you to have all of those for the price of fun. So yeah, this is, even though you're stating a semantic fact, it doesn't necessarily mean that the semantic fact is some externally transcendent and absolute fact about the world. It doesn't necessitate that. A lot of people can believe that, but I don't think it necessitates that, at least this definition, since it suggests that moral language functions to express a complex state of mind rather than to describe the semantic facts about the world. That said, we could easily add in like a semantic component to this, yet it mimics descriptive language in its grammar, right? So this is where, it looks like semantics. You might believe it to be semantically true, but really it's got a lot more going on. All right, so then we've got quasi-realism, a branch of expressivism championed by Simon Blackburn that claims we earn the right to talk as if moral facts exist, using terms like true or fact, because of the disciplined nature of our moral discourse, even though the underlying reality is projective, not descriptive. All right, and then the cognitive frameworks, emotion, sentiment based. These views hold that moral judgments are beliefs that can be true or false, but the source of these truths or our access to them is rooted in human sensibility. Interesting. I don't know how you get away with this. This is pretty tough. Moral sentimentalism, the view that moral distinctions are derived from emotional responses, sentiments, rather than pure reason. But what would that mean? What would it mean for it to be true or false then? Classic sentimentalism is Humean. Moral vice and virtue are defined by the feelings of approval or disapproval they trigger in an observer. Neo-sentimentalism, fitting attitude theories, to judge something as wrong is to judge that it merits or is fitting for a specific emotional response like guilt or indignation. bridging the gap between feeling and reason. Virtue ethics, affective varieties. While often structural, many forms of virtue ethics, like Aristotle's, emphasize the training of emotions so that the virtuous person not only does the right thing, but feels the right way about it. Oh, this is crazy. This is cool. All right, so there's like difficulties with each of these, though. One being, like, how do you know that your conscience isn't calibrated to do something that everyone else on the planet thinks is evil? And for you think it's good. You're following the feelings, and it's leading you in a place where other people might say is not good. So you can't hold like it to be true just because you feel it to be that way. So that's an issue. The training of emotions is what we end up pushing for, but we don't assume that there's just a right way about it already, and you train your emotions to get to the right way. The morality in our view, in the view that the document's going to eventually take, is going to be about the process of finding what is moral. It's going to be a responsibility to stay engaged with our moral understanding and our relationship with whatever, God or your conscience or the world or others. It's something where you can't just, it's not a one and done thing, and it requires a relationship over time. It would seem to me that this philosophy is pushing towards intent as causal. Oh, okay, it's pushing towards intent as causal. What does intent as causal mean? Like in a deterministic sense, this philosophy is pushing towards a notion of our moral judgments in the moment being predisposed in some sense. And we could consider what the predisposition means here, like what is contributing to us being predisposed to think something to be moral and not. And, we can base it on, or we can point out our past understanding, things that we've learned, past experiences. We could also point out, as we are in these discussions, our bodily influences in the moment. So, as we discussed yesterday, you smell something fishy and that predisposes you to think the way that you do. And that doesn't mean that it's completely causing what you feel, but it's affecting what you feel. All right, cognitive frameworks, reason-based. These views argue that moral truths are discovered through intellect and reasoning, independent of emotion. So moral rationalism, the view that moral principles are knowable a priori through reason alone, much like mathematical truths. So unfortunately, we have to reject this. Moral intuitionism, the view that basic moral truths are self-evident to a mature mind. We have to reject this as well. This is way too ambiguous. We grasp them immediately upon reflection. So once again, this falls into the same issue that moral sentimentalism falls into. That if it's just your intuition upon reflection that is guiding your what you believe to be morally true, or morally self-evident, then you can find yourself in a position where your conscience is calibrated to do things that other people would find to be heinous. Okay, realist and anti-realist distinctions. These frameworks address whether moral facts exist independently of human minds. Moral realism, the belief that moral facts exist objectively independent of what anyone thinks or feels. This is the thing that I mainly try to challenge every day almost. Naturalism, moral facts are natural facts. For example, good equates to conducive to happiness or evolutionary fitness and can be studied empirically. Well, okay, you can take this route, but I don't know if I don't think when people think about morality, they're referring to this. Like, this is a very specific perspective on morality that we could take. And it would be interesting if you tried to leverage this. The problem is that our society changes in significant ways. So what has led to evolutionary fitness might not lead to happiness today. And also what leads to happiness today is slightly ambiguous, as we discuss all the time with regard to like the moral landscape and just utilitarianism in general. It's difficult to consider what happiness means and how much happiness balances out suffering, and there's a lot to unpack with the notion of happiness. That being said, I imagine like the moral landscape is a sort of naturalism. Okay, non-naturalism, moral facts are objective, but sui generis, unique. They cannot be reduced to natural properties like pleasure or pain, often associated with G.E. Morse. We have to just assault this immediately. I don't even know why we would spend too much time with this one. All right, moral relativism, the view that the truth of moral judgment is relative to the standards of a specific group, culture, individual. So obviously we have to be very careful about notions of moral relativism. Like in some sense, we hold like a relativistic view where what people end up feeling to be moral is based on their own contingencies, their own culture, the way they were brought up, etc. And the issue there, though, is to consider what it would mean for that moral judgment to be true in some objective sense. So, like, yeah, what each person believes to be true perhaps necessitates that they push that will onto other people in such a way where we should it's not like just because we see some other society having crazy norms that are, way against our own moral norms that we should just allow them to do that because, we just know that they got there out of, contingency. We should, as part of our own moral framework, we should try to stop what we believe to be immoral behavior. So that's like the nuance that we have to have there. How in God's name would a moral fact exist independently of a human mind? That's just bizarre and paradoxical on its face. Hey, I try to argue against that, right? Like I try to point out how subjective our understandings actually are and what that means towards this notion of some external truth. At the end of the day, who decides the external truth? If everyone's got a very different understanding of the world that is based on, affected by their very different physiology and their very different past and their very different DNA and all these things that contribute to what each person believes. I mean, take away moral there, and I'm curious, do you feel the same way? Because that's really at the crux of it. That's the most fundamental thing. How would a fact exist independently of a human mind? And that's the tricky part. I guess you might think that like a moral fact has to do with people, and therefore it can't exist independently. But yeah, I'm trying to point out that facts in general are experienced in the moment, or they could be written down. And they could be read and stuff like that. To feel that a fact is true requires the experience in that moment. All right. Error theory, moral nihilism, the view that moral language tries to state objective facts, unlike emotivism, but fails because no such facts exist. Therefore, all positive moral claims are technically false. Right, so we have to now talk about what we're trying to do. But yeah, this is actually like a great philosophy as a foil, because it really forces us to take up a normative pragmatism that allows us to make clear. It's like pointing out the elephant in the room. Like, what are we trying to do? Like, what is the point here? Why shouldn't we just say that all, moral claims are false if everyone's got a different understanding of the world, and therefore everyone's view of what is true and false is actually kind of different in some sense? We have to point out, that yeah, this is difficult. And once it comes to the society level, like once we get to the social level, we need to consider how we can aggregate moral opinions for the sake of people's well-being. And at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to what people are compelled by, and it comes down to discussions and this whole social dynamic. But yeah, if someone tells you, if the thing that's morally right is to drink the Kool-Aid, then everyone just dies. And that's it, everyone thought that was moral to do in that moment. All right, constructivist frameworks. These views try to find a middle ground, arguing that moral truths are constructed by human agents under specific conditions. Okay. So now, yeah, so in each of these cases, we're talking about something different when we're talking about moral truths, pretty much. And that's something to point out. So in this view, I would think that like moral truth is something more like a societal moral truth, which, we can easily talk about as something that exists, as something that is still a little ambiguous, but you could at least like think about it in the level of abstraction of people operating as if this is true, and each person has a pragmatically similar understanding of this truth that they will operate under that truth, such as you should not kill and whatnot. And obviously, it's not like no one does that in our country or in this country, in the country I exist in, or in any country. But most people abide by this truth that everyone pragmatically understands similarly enough. Now, you might argue, like, what do you mean by pragmatically similar understanding. Isn't it obvious what killing is? But I would point out that what people think of as like what killing would be, or what like necessary or unnecessary killing would be, is like very much subjective. So, which is why people will kill, because they think it's like morally fine to do if they need to like feed their family or something like that, or if they have to defend themselves. People differ in what it would mean for you to defend yourself, when you should or should not. There's so much ambiguity in even just understanding that type of true axiom, that moral truth. All right, then we got moral truths are neither external objects, objective facts, nor mere expressions of feelings. Instead, they are the output of a correct procedure of practical reasoning. Okay, so this is a little ambiguous. What would be the correct procedure? Because it's a moral judgment as to what the procedure should be, right? It's like, what defines a correct procedure here? You have a paradox now. You need the moral truth about what the procedure should be, but you need the procedure to get the moral truth. Justice is what rational actors would agree to behind a veil of ignorance. Okay. All right. Moral norms derive their authority from a mutual agreement or social contract among individuals. Contractarianism. Morality is a set of rules self-interested agents agree to for mutual advantage. Morality consists of principles that no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced agreement. In some pragmatic sense, this is kind of how things go, but then the problem is when two societies, bump up, or two populations bump up with their moral frameworks, and each of them thinks that what they have is true because they have agreed to it, but not everyone has agreed to it. So now you have this issue where you have to do something about the other group. And that's how we arrive at wars and stuff. Okay, then the next thing I think we want to do is, okay, can you help me determine where I'm at? So for now, let's play a game where I point out criteria and you simply disqualify frameworks. All right, first, let's get rid of any framework that would have trouble with the reality that people's conscience can be calibrated to the point where they do things that others, and perhaps most others, find reprehensible. For example, Ordinary Men. That's the book about the ordinary men who became Nazis. So that's the big example there. Your framework disqualification method is genius here. Keep using it. Thank you. So I'm challenging the idea that just because someone feels like there's a moral fact that's independent of them, that doesn't mean that there is some moral fact independent of them in some tangible way, let's just say. All right, this is a great starting point. The Ordinary Men scenario referencing the Reserve Police Battalion 101 highlights moral plasticity, the fact that the conscience is not a fixed, immutable compass, but something that can be retuned by authority, ideology, or desensitization, based on the criteria that a framework must account for the malleability and fallibility of the conscience. Here is what we are disqualifying. Naive moral intuitionism, why it fails here. This framework relies on the idea that moral truths are self-evident and accessible to any mature mind, just like realizing 2 + 2 = 4. If moral truths are self-evident, like do not murder innocent people, it becomes incredibly difficult to explain how thousands of ordinary people could simply fail to see them. You get in this crazy discussion of like what it would mean for to be a mature mind, and you'd have to be like, they were evil. That's not a mature mind. And, there's nowhere to go with that. If I was arguing with someone who said that, the argument's over. We can't move forward. Intuitionism suggests struggles to explain deep systemic moral divergence. So, okay, disqualified rigid moral sense theory, why it fails here. This is a specific subset of sentimentalism or intuitionism that views the conscience as a distinct innate organ like eyes or ears that detects moral qualities. If we had a dedicated moral sense akin to eyesight, we would expect everyone to see the same colors of right and wrong. All right. What survives and why? We got, moral sentimentalism, rationalism. So I have to go back to the start, and we got to come up with the next criteria. 2 + 2 = 4 is not self-evident. One must understand the concept of numbers as well as addition and equality. Absolutely. Yeah, it's very much cultural that we understand that. And when I say that it's cultural, I don't mean that it's just like the fact that I am in a culture. Like Like, we have to ground this in the actual physical processes that are happening because I'm in this culture. It was a lot of learning and internalization and conditioning that leads me to understand what a 2 is when I look at that visual stimuli. And it just feels like it now exists independently of me. But really what's happening is predictive processing, and the experience that 2 feels like it exists is being afforded by a lot of different parts of my brain that are giving my experience its linguistic aspect, its emotional aspect, its feeling of certainty. All right, so what were some of the other things that I mentioned? Should I go with a heavy hitter? I feel like I should go with the low-hanging fruit first. Like, okay, following on this train of thought, we need to point out that if culture can affect moral judgment, then we can't hold that moral judgment is solely rational unless we hold that rational thought is also contingent on culture. Now, we do have significant evidence that our bodily processes affect our moral judgments, at least slightly and unconsciously. All right, I'm just going to see where it goes with that one. Here we go. This is a decisive cut. You are introducing the criterion of embodied and enculturated cognition. You are essentially arguing that because the hardware, the body, and the software, culture, fundamentally alter the output, moral judgment, we cannot treat morality as a product of pure software, reason, running in a vacuum. Here is what gets disqualified on the reality of physiological and cultural interference. Disqualified, strict moral rationalism. So, Kantian ethics, strict rationalism relies on the premise that moral duties are derived from pure practical reason, a faculty that is supposed to function independently of our physical inclinations and cultural conditioning. The conflict. Kant famously argued that for an action to be truly moral, it must be motivated by duty, reason, not by how you feel or what your body wants. The reality check, if, as you noticed, a judge is harsher when hungry, or if a person's definition of rational is shaped by their upbringing, then pure reason is a myth. There is no clean room in the human mind where rational calculations happen without biological contamination. Rationalism fails because it assumes a separation between mind and body that does not exist. Okay. Disqualified, moral realism, non-naturalism. The view holds that moral truths are abstract, eternal entities like mathematical forms existing outside the physical world, which we access through our intellect. If our moral compass is swayed by the level of serotonin in our brains or the cultural stories we heard as toddlers, it becomes very difficult to argue that we are accessing an eternal, unchanging third realm of abstract truth. So this is the challenge against this idea of independent truths when it relates to morality. This is often called the debunking argument. If our judgments track with our biology, survival instincts, disgust, sensitivity, rather than tracking abstract truths, then Platonism cannot explain why we judge the way we do. What survives? The remaining frameworks are thriving in this environment because they don't just tolerate the messiness of the body and culture, they require it. So moral sentimentalism, strong contender. Why? It posits that morality is a sentiment. If your body changes, for example, brain damage or hormones, your sentiments change and thus your moral judgments change. This framework predicts exactly what you described. So then we got moral emotivism, expressivism. Since moral claims are expressions of attitudes, and attitudes are psychological, physiological states, it makes perfect sense that they would fluctuate with your body and culture. We got moral naturalism. This view sees moral facts as natural facts. For example, about human flourishing. Since humans are biological organisms evolved in cultures, naturalism is perfectly comfortable studying how biology and culture constrain our morality. And then we got Humean constructivism, which is our next target. Unlike Kantian constructivism, which aims for universal reason, Humean constructivism builds morality out of the actual concerns and commitments of people, which include their bodily needs and cultural values. What else could we get? Could we try to pick off? Okay, we could get rid of this correct procedure real easily. Okay, if rationality / reasoning activities, I'll say social reasoning activities / what was the word here? Procedures. are contingent on culture and also somewhat affected by emotion, then there's an issue with believing in true rational laws, social reasoning, prescriptions maybe, oughts, and social procedures. And there's an issue with believing in true of these things. There's a paradox. In order to determine what is morally true, one must follow the true procedure, and what constitutes the moral procedure requires a moral procedure. In other words, people will disagree on what is a moral way of getting to the moral truth. Okay, that's gonna be the next one. This leads us to have debates about utilitarianism versus deontology. Even amongst utilitarianists, there is dispute about what constitutes the value to be optimized. For example, how much well-being balances with how much suffering. How distributed should the well-being be? Oh my gosh, let's distinguish between the survivors. Do you believe that despite these bodily and cultural influences, there is still an objective fact of the matter about what is right and wrong? So we'll get there. We'll get there. Gemini's trying to expedite this process here. All right, you have just articulated a devastating critique known as the problem of the Criterion, or the Munchausen Trilemma applied to ethics. You are arguing that we cannot use a moral procedure like a vote, a rational calculation, or a thought experiment to find the truth, because we first need a prior moral procedure to validate that the first procedure was the correct one. It is turtles all the way down. Yep, there's a recursive paradox here. Who decides what the moral procedure is to figure out what is morally true? Because you view the tools of morality, reason, optimization, social agreement, as inherently unstable and culturally tainted, we must disqualify any framework that claims to possess a self-authenticating objective formula for right and wrong. So moral constructivism. Constructivists believe that moral truths are the output of a correct procedure. For example, what would rational agents agree to behind a veil of ignorance? So this is the assumed thing, the presupposed moral procedure. Your argument destroys the starting point of these procedures. You rightly point out that we can't even agree on what a rational agent values without importing our own cultural biases. If the input is biased, the output is not objective truth. It's just biased consensus. And then we get rid of objective utilitarianism. This view treats morality as an engineering problem. Maximize X. As you noted, X is undefined. Is it total happiness, average happiness, minimizing pain, distributive justice? Since there is no objective meta procedure to determine which variable we ought to maximize, utilitarianism dissolves into subjective preference. It cannot claim to be the singular science of morality if its foundational variables are chosen arbitrarily. And you could argue that it's not arbitrarily, but you do have to argue that it's somewhat arbitrary, right? Like, this makes it seem like the entire thing is arbitrary, but at least if more than zero is arbitrary, then it can't have a hold on an objective truth. That's the point. So what survives? The anti-foundationalists. We are now left with the frameworks that admit there is no neutral objective ground to stand on. These views accept that we are trapped inside our own biology and culture. We got moral emotivism, expressivism. It completely sidesteps your paradox. It says you are right, there is no true procedure. When we debate utilitarian versus deontology, we aren't arguing over facts, we are just expressing different emotional commitments. It accepts that reasoning in ethics is mostly post hoc rationalization of our feelings. Moral relativism, why it fits, it embraces the contingency you identified. It says, yes, moral truth is generated by procedures, but those procedures are only valid locally. The truth of a moral claim is strictly relative to the culture or framework you happen to be standing in. There is no view from nowhere. Error theory, moral nihilism is still around. This is the most cynical survivor. It agrees with you that valid moral rules would require an objective procedure, but since, as you proved, no such procedure exists, morality is a sham. When people argue about right or utility, they are making a fundamental error. They are looking for objective answers in a world that only has subjective preferences. And then we got a pragmatic sentimentalism. This view stops looking for true laws and settles for what works for us. Okay, this is our winner. It admits our values are contingent and emotional, but argues we can still talk about them meaningfully, not as eternal truths, but as shared human projects. We don't need an objective procedure. We just need to get along. We use reason not to find truth, but to negotiate our clumsy social existence. Okay, the final distinguishing question. We are down to the anti-realist and pragmatist camp. To isolate your specific worldview, we need to know how you handle the consequences of this lack of objective truth. You see a culture that practices something you find undeniably horrific. For example, rigid caste slavery. You know their procedure, culture/reason validates it, and yours condemns it. You know there is no objective God's eye view to say who is right. How do you respond? This is like an interview question that is impossible to answer, except we're going to answer it. All right, option A, the emotivist, expressivist route. I can't prove them wrong with logic/facts, but I still fight them because my emotional commitment to freedom is stronger than my desire for logical proof. Morality is a battle of wills/emotions. That should stay on to the next round. Option B, the error theorist. Technically, neither of us is right. The universe doesn't care. My opposition to them is just a biological preference, like preferring chocolate over vanilla. But with guns, morality is an illusion. So we would want to get rid of this, but why, right? That's the question here. The pragmatist. I can't appeal to eternal truth, but I can appeal to shared consequences. I will try to persuade them that their way causes misery, hoping our shared biology makes them care about misery too. That seems naive, but... So it would actually be somewhere in between option A and option C, honestly, that I think we can hold. But like now we're just dealing with semantics and pragmatics. Like really, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to say? What are we trying to do? Is there anything that was overlooked, though? I feel like we didn't kill them all. So maybe we first can lump emotivism and expressivism together. Now let's consider whether we are allowed to collapse moral emotivism and moral prescriptivism into moral expressivism. I do want to point out one more thing to this. It's not just that populations' moral judgments are local to their culture, but that individuals' moral judgments are local to their idiosyncratic lives. For example, nature and nurture, maybe what they just smelled, whether they're hungry, just pointing out that it's not just like, culture affects a population and everyone in that population has the same moral judgment. There's we have to be as granular as the people, as the individuals. Okay, now let's consider whether we are allowed to collapse moral emotivism and moral prescriptivism into moral expressivism. In one of the two main Taoist books, I forget which one, they say nothing is ever said. Wow. That's another one. That's like similar to nihilism, where it's like, what is it? What is that actually telling us? What is the value of that? I think the value is there insofar as it points out that each person infers something different, therefore there's no objective information that has been said. Like there's nothing that is true in the world, so you would say nothing has been said, but it's also ambiguous as to what nothing is ever said means, and you might come away with it as in some sort of nihilistic sense, which I would say let's be real careful about. Nihilism is far more sinister, right? I mean, once you get to nihilism, it's far more sinister. So we want to make sure that we don't say things that are ambiguous enough to lead us to nihilism. Okay, now let's consider whether we are allowed to collapse moral emotivism and moral prescriptivism into moral expressivism. Why would we do that? Well, the only way I think I can do this is, even though contemporary philosophies like Brandon's theory of mind allow us to think about attitudes as interconnected, such that you can't get a pragmatic emote without a semantic attitude and a normative prescription, we would ideally justify this with some sort of scientific grounding. Farthest I think we can go is some sort of contemporary schema theory, which actually connects specific concepts with specific neural activity. There is only preliminary research on these types of neural correlates. We can speculatively imagine that the networks that are activated for one of these aspects of the concept are also activated or primed in relation to or response to the other. All right, that was the best I could say that. I don't know if there's a better argument. Like, you'd have to make the argument grounded in some science rather than the philosophy. The philosophy allows us to see this all easily together, but I should point out specifically, this is partly because such a philosophical telling is fundamentally speculative, and the feelings I have about it are similarly contingent, just like all my culturally contingent beliefs, moral and otherwise. Okay, there we go. That's a lot to throw at it. And we need one more thing to axe away the moral nihilism, but we can get to that next. All right, this is a sophisticated synthesis. You are effectively proposing a naturalized moral expressivism, one that discards the splitter distinctions of 20th century analytic philosophy, which treats emotions, commands, and beliefs as separate logical entities, in favor of a lumper view, consistent with modern cognitive science. You are asking, can we collapse emotivism, prescriptivism, and expressivism into a single category because the brain doesn't actually respect these boundaries? The answer is yes. Here is how we justify the collapse using scientific grounding you requested and where it places you on the map. All right, your intuition about schema theory and neural networks effectively renders the old distinctions obsolete. In the brain, the feeling, emotivism, and the instruction, prescriptivism, and the concept, expressivism, are not distinct sequential steps. They are parallel, entangled processes. The concept is the simulation, grounded cognition. Research in embodied cognition, suggests that to possess a concept like harm or justice, your brain essentially simulates the sensory and motor states associated with it. You don't just access the data of the word, you microactivate the neural regions for pain, disgust, or pushing away. And when we say microactivate, we're pointing out that a lot of times this is very much unconscious to us. We don't realize that we're doing this in the moment. Affect is intrinsic to judgment. The somatic marker hypothesis, Damasio, supports your view. We don't make a rational judgment and then add an emotion. The emotion, the somatic state, is often the mechanism of the judgment. All right, action potentials, the prescriptive element. In the brain, perception and action are tightly coupled. Right. Okay. So this is huge. This is a huge deal. We're getting into what fires together, wires together. When we say what fires together, wires together, we're actually talking, like, at the most granular sense, we're talking about action potentials, which is actually the communication from one neuron to the other. So to perceive a moral violation often automatically primes motor cortex activity, avoidance, or confrontation. Therefore, the emote, disgust, and the prescription, stay away, are arguably the same neural event observed from two different angles, right? And a lot of times these things are conditioned. Like you learn what to stay away from the what fires together, wires together, or what fires apart, wires apart. Conclusion: you are essentially arguing for a holistic cognitive affective state, the distinction between boo on stealing, emotivism, and don't steal, prescriptivism. The distinction is a linguistic artifact, not a neurological reality. Okay, the consequence: radical idiosyncrasy. You added a crucial constraint. Judgments are local not just to culture, but to the specific idiosyncratic neural history of the individual. Hunger, sleep, trauma, specific upbringing. This moves you toward a position of moral particularism via neural determinism. If my moral judgment is the output of a unique, transient, biologically contingent neural network, then universal moral laws are impossible because no two brains have identical schemas/histories, and moral debate is effectively a translation error. I am referencing my neural schema of justice, weighted by my history of hunger and fear, and you are referencing yours. We use the same word but activate different networks. All right, your revised taxonomy, the eliminativist turn. By collapsing these categories and grounding them in idiosyncratic biology, you have arguably excited the realm of moral philosophy, which assumes there are norms to discuss, and entered moral psychology, which simply describes mechanisms. Here is where you likely sit now: naturalized non-cognitivism. This view holds that ontology, moral facts do not exist. So I'm going to have to yell at this thing for going a little too far here. Moral facts do not exist. Moral language is an expression of a complex, culturally and biologically tuned internal state. There is no knowing right from wrong. There is only the activation of learned schemas. The distinction between feeling, believing, and commanding is artificial. All right, the new problem, the so what? If we accept this, that moral judgments are just idiosyncratic, biologically contingent brain burps, we face a pragmatic crisis. There we go. We face a pragmatic crisis. If Brandom is right, inferentialism, concepts get their meaning from the rules of use in a social game. But if everyone is playing a slightly different game based on their own blood sugar and childhood trauma, how is society possible? This leads to the final branching point of your taxonomy. Given that moral judgments are idiosyncratic and biologically contingent, what is the function of moral language? So I'm going to say right, the concept / consequences of the radical idiosyncrasies need to be considered here. We can't just jump all the way to saying morality is wrong or morality is useless. There are a few things we need to do to get out of this hole. Okay, our discussions about what we should be doing, like morally speaking, are contingent upon each of our individual understandings, but also our cultural understanding. Okay, so that was the first thing that we have to do here. The second question, the second thing we need to do is consider pragmatically what we are trying to get at with morality. When we discuss morality, what are we trying to have happen? What each person wants out of a moral discussion is subjective. We did this fun activity where we asked Gemini to come up with a taxonomy of moral frameworks, and then we slowly kept giving Gemini criteria for what we should get rid of. We kind of kept pointing out either scientific facts or logical takeaways, and we've been eliminating. We've been playing moral framework survivor here, and we're down to the point of we can see how subjective someone's moral understanding is, but now we still have moral nihilism here, so we have to get rid of moral nihilism somehow. Did it just end up defaulting to Harris's moral landscape? Well, I think Harris's moral landscape got disqualified at some point because of its ambiguities. A part of Sam's view is that there is some sort of objective direction at least we should go in, which kind of got grabbed here. All right, so yeah, this is just the preamble here. So what? If we accept this, that moral judgments are just idiosyncratic, biologically contingent brain burps, we face a pragmatic crisis. Brandom is right. Inferentialism, concepts get their meaning from the rules of use in a social game, but if everyone is playing a slightly different game based on their own blood sugar and childhood trauma, how is society possible? This leads to the final branching point for your taxonomy. So it's asking me, like, what is the function of moral language? And so I'm pointing out that we can't even indulge that type of question, because that, what does that question mean? We kind of have to follow in our pragmatism that we've so far followed. So I wrote out a bunch of things. Let's see where this goes. All right, we get the little bit of glaze here. This is a reconstruction. You have effectively climbed out of the nihilistic hole by shifting the metric. So we didn't even mention nihilism, so I guess it's helping us out here. It's pointing out that what we said implies that we don't just get into nihilism. You have effectively climbed out of the nihilistic hole by shifting the metric from objective truth, which is impossible, to pragmatic stability, which is observable. You are describing a system where morality functions as a distributed operating system. Individual installations vary, but the protocols are similar enough, pragmatic similarity, to allow for networking, social equilibria. Here is the broadest taxonomy for this specific pragmatic naturalist realm you are now inhabiting. These frameworks accept the biological cultural contingency you describe, but focus on how stability emerges anyway. The evolutionary coordination frameworks, these views focus on your point about the Baldwin effect and social equilibria. They treat morality as a successful evolutionary strategy for managing distinct agents. So evolutionary pragmatism. Philip Kitcher, morality is a form of social technology that evolved to solve the problem of altruism failures. We don't have moral rules, but we have moral progress, defined as the refinement of social practices that reduce conflict and allow cooperation. It aligns with your view of the Baldwin effect, culture acting as a selective pressure that shapes our biology to be more norm compliant. The issue here, though, is there's still like an ambiguity among, or referring to what is the transcendent moral truth that comes out of this. Like, we still can't point to this as determining what is morally true, because we get in the same problem that we had earlier, where we are now defining like the mechanism of determining what is morally true. And the question is who determines what the moral mechanism for determining what is morally true should be. You need a moral mechanism for that, and you got the turtles all the way down. All right, game theoretic conventionalism. We got David Lewis and Skyrms. Moral norms are signaling equilibria. Why do we not stab each other at the supermarket? Because we have converged on a stable strategy, a convention, where cooperation yields better payoff than defection. This explains your supermarket safety example. It's not that the shopper knows stabbing is objectively wrong. It's that you are both in a stable Nash equilibrium of non-violence. Even that's a little bit ambiguous. It's not like a lot of times Nash equilibria are pointing out things where all the players in the game are cognizant of the option and they're not doing it. In this case, people are just conditioned not to even consider doing that type of thing. All right, the neurocomputational frameworks. These views focus on your point about predictive processing and expectation violation. So predictive processing ethics, active inference. The brain is a prediction machine. Immoral behavior is essentially high surprisal behavior. We follow norms to minimize the metabolic cost of prediction error. If I steal your apple, I create chaos on predictability. If I buy it, I maintain the predictable social flow. This scientifically grounds your expectation violation point. Morality is the shared set of priors. Okay, so I have to say, I don't want to objectively define morality in some absolute sense. Doing so would be counter to what we've discussed so far. I'm going to say not allowed according to what we've discussed so far. Okay, affective alignment theory. This is making up theories, but it's basically just saying what I tried saying and characterizing it as a specific theory. We don't just predict actions, we simulate feelings. Moral judgment is the synchronization of affective states. When we discuss morality, we are literally trying to tune our neural networks to oscillate at the same frequency as our peers. This is kind of ridiculous, but at a fundamental level, like an unintentional level or an unconscious level, we do kind of regulate ourselves. When I discuss topics like predictive processing and affective alignment, I'm not attempting to be prescriptive in some sense. I'm merely trying to point out concepts like homeostasis, allostasis, personal and social homeostasis and allostasis. Okay, the social linguistic frameworks. These views focus on your point about random semantics and the normative nature of concepts. Normative pragmatism. Okay. Concepts aren't representations of the world. They are tickets to participate in a social game of giving and asking for reasons. So really, I try to ground concepts as neural activity. To have a concept of cruelty is to understand the norms of when it is appropriate to punish someone or express outrage. And just to be clear, this isn't to cognizantly understand norms, but to implicitly understand norms in your actions. So that's the pragmatic nature of this. This is what we mean by pragmatically similar understandings. This validates your view that the semantic meaning is inseparable from the normative. You can't learn the word chair without learning the rule things you sit on. You can't learn theft without learning things you shouldn't do. A collaborative expressivism, a refinement of classical expressivism. It admits our views are idiosyncratic expressions, but argues that the function of expressing them is to negotiate a common plan of life. We are essentially saying, here is my map. Let's try to draw a shared map. All right, I should say, also, I'm not trying to point out different / competing frameworks, but attempting to combine these into one coherent, comprehensive, descriptive, not prescriptive framework. We have a solid descriptive model of what morality is in your view. The final question is normative. Given that you know your moral feelings are just compelling biological signals designed for coordination, how do you personally decide when to trust them? Oh, that's a huge question, actually. I didn't even answer the question in this. All that said, your final question is still outstanding. We do need heuristics of some sort. For each person, their own understanding provides those heuristics, and consider how we can leverage our own understanding in order to determine what we each should do. Okay, let's jump the gun here. In my mind, this leads us to the following simple framework, which we could develop further into many other implications. As long as I have a understanding of morality such that I believe that there are things that I should do and shouldn't do, then I have a moral responsibility, according to my very understanding of the concept of morality, to determine what is moral, what is such isn't moral, and then to actually abide by it. Yeah, that's the only thing that we could come up with in part 3, really, as a foundation. We're not allowed to say you should open the door for someone or you shouldn't attack someone. All we can do in the type of telling that we have so far in our document is a personal direction. Like, how do you navigate morality? And this is our basis. Now we have to still get in that whole discussion about how we need heuristics in order to ensure that we don't fall into a type of morality that we would originally think is reprehensible, right? This all started pointing out the whole concept of the book Ordinary Men, which was, the ordinary men that ended up facilitating the Holocaust, and how their moral compass was able to slowly, because of social dynamics, get to a point where they could do things that felt fine but were reprehensible according to many other people, and even themselves probably 5 years prior. We need some sort of heuristic, and we have to develop that in part 3. That's huge. This is just pointing out that, once again, this morality is going to have to be some sort of relationship over time. It can't just be a one and done. So, all right, let's just run it here. Let's see what happens. All right, this is a crucial pivot. You are moving away from shopping for a pre-existing label and instead building a unified descriptive architecture. You want to see the whole machine, from the neuron to social norm, working as one continuous process. Right, that's kind of the comprehensiveness of the document here. Here is a synthesis of the concepts you laid out: allostasis, predictive processing, schema theory, idiosyncrasy, and social coordination into one coherent framework. We can call this the biosocial homeostatic framework. Jesus. At the descriptive root, morality is not a set of laws. It is a high-level function of allostasis, the process of achieving stability through change. Your organism needs to maintain viability, homeostasis. To do this efficiently, the brain doesn't just react, it predicts needs. When the brain predicts a threat to viability, it generates a prediction error. This error is experienced subjectively as affect, as emotion, anxiety, guilt, disgust. The thing that it might be missing here is affect affects the trajectory of our understanding. This going down into the nitty-gritty, this involves the release of neuromodulators like dopamine or acetylcholine that affects our learning in the moment. Translation: what we call moral judgment is the conscious readout of these deep regulatory processes. That is wrong is the semantic interface for this behavior violates my prediction. So, it's not necessarily that it violates your predictive model. In some cases, when you think about what is moral and not moral, it's actually abiding by your predictive processing. It's what you're primed to think of in that moment. So, idiosyncratic schemas, you correctly pointed out that this is radically individual. Your predictive models are built from your specific history and your specific biology. Therefore, your moral sense is unique to you. When you see a theft, you aren't accessing a universal definition. You are activating a neural schema associated with your past experiences of loss, insecurity, or rule breaking. But really, it's a lot of times it's your activating a neural schema that's associated with just what you learned. It would, obviously, if you've lost things in the past, that'll affect it. But chances are, what really internalized this is like a bunch of other learning that you just got over a lifetime. And sometimes that doesn't lead you to even thinking theft is bad, right? People do steal for the sake of what they believe to be morally good or morally not reprehensible. And then once again, we can make sense of how sometimes we can rationalize something as being immoral, but we don't feel like it's immoral. Yeah, like you might find that stealing something in a convenience store is more moral or rationally equally immoral to torrenting something, but emotionally, you might even think that rationally torrenting something that's $10 is worse than stealing something that's $2 in a store. Granted, you could get into the discussion of who you're stealing from and all that stuff. But when you think about whether or not you're going to actually do it, you would find the stealing in the store to be much more morally salient, in the sense that you feel like that's something you would have to do. You think about stealing via torrent. That's something that's really easy, and based on what we read yesterday, that would make it feel less immoral in the moment that you actually do it or consider doing it. So, all right, no objective morality. In this framework, searching for objective morality is like searching for objective hunger. Hunger is a real regulatory signal, but it is internal to the organism. Okay. Pragmatic alignment, the social layer. If we are all trapped in our own predictive bubbles, how does society function? Humans are obligatorily gregarious. My homeostasis depends on your behavior. Therefore, my predictive model must include predictions about you. We generate shared symbols, words like justice, rights, to act as bridges between our disparate neural networks. I don't like when it says like we do things to do something, because that implies some sort of cognizant intentionality. But we end up generating these symbols over time as they actually, I wouldn't even say because it bridges our disparate neural networks. It does a lot of things. Like these symbols end up allowing our society to survive. But we probably, you could say more generally, we generated communication via evolution because it helped us all survive. So it's not like norms were tools that we ever came up with. Norms were always there via evolution. In general, we don't want to be too assertive about what morality is. The telling needs to be more pragmatic oriented. I'm being really nitpicky because this is like still pretty close. Okay. Unfortunately, I mean, we are jumping the gun with this morality topic, and we aren't going to be actually, going into morality content and writing all this stuff down until... I mean, I really should be writing down notes from what this spits out here as just like probably a better telling than what I just said. At some point, I'll probably have to keep giving it pointers, and eventually it'll get to something that quote unquote effectively knows what I'm trying to say, even though that's not how language models work. But then once it knows what I'm trying to say effectively, then I can ask, hey, can you write out like a whole entire thing about this? And that might give us more more to think about that can help us develop our own ideas. This is a vital correction. You're steering us away from a just so story where humans invented morality to solve a problem toward a strictly evolutionary and developmental account where morality is a complex emergent property of organisms that learn. Here is the revised descriptive biosocial framework. It avoids defining what morality is and instead describes the mechanisms, how biological systems regulate themselves, and how pragmatic similarities emerge without top-down design. And sometimes with top-down design in some sense, but yeah, most fundamentally without top-down design. The mechanism of change, affect-driven allostasis. You rightly pointed out that affect isn't just a readout, it is the architect of the brain's wiring. The brain constantly predicts sensory inputs. When reality deviates from prediction, the brain registers prediction error. So that could be social rejection or physical pain. So affect as the teaching signal. This error is experienced as affect. This affective surge is the neurochemical trigger for neuroplasticity. It tells the brain your model is wrong. We rewire the connections. Over time, this is how character or conscience forms. We aren't just returning to baseline. We are structurally changing our predictive models to better anticipate future challenges. That's where allostasis shines here. Your moral understanding is the cumulative scar tissue and muscle memory of a lifetime of affective learning. It changes physically as you interact with the world. All right, the emergence of communication and norms. We strip away the idea that humans invented symbols to bridge gaps. Instead, we look at co-evolution. Signaling as adaptation. From the start, organisms signaled posture, sound. Signals that led to successful coordination were selected for. The Baldwin effect. As culture/signaling became more complex, it created a new environment. Individuals who could better learn and navigate this symbolic niche survived. Emergence, not design. We didn't decide to have shared norms. Populations that drifted toward pragmatically similar behaviors simply outpersisted those that didn't. The messiness of social dynamics is the noise inherent in this evolutionary drift. It's never perfectly optimized. All right, the practical what now, navigating the landscape. This brings us to the responsibility aspect you emphasized, not as a cosmic duty, but as a function of having a high fidelity predictive model. So to keep in mind is like the only reason that we can get this type of presupposition is just having the notion, the concept of morality. Like, provided you understand that there's things that you can do or that you can't do, you should do or you shouldn't do, then this applies to you, given what we've talked about. When your brain's model strongly predicts that a certain action is required based on your idiosyncratic history schema, morally required, that prediction manifests as a compulsion or sense of duty. The responsibility then is to act against this strong prediction is to introduce massive internal conflict. Therefore, the responsibility to abide by your understanding is essentially the drive to maintain agency. Oh my gosh, I didn't even give it that. But that's what we do in part 1. The responsibility to abide by your understanding of what you should do according to your notion of freedom and agency is what led to agency in part 1. But yeah, I'm glad that it understands kind of what I'm getting at using different words. Discomfort is expected. As you notice, this path isn't about feeling good or avoiding anxiety. In fact, acting morally often generates high immediate error signals in service of a deeper long-term predictive conviction. The moral person is often the one willing to endure the short-term allostatic load, anxiety, to preserve the integrity of their long-term understanding. Okay. The unified descriptive narrative in this framework, a human agent is not a philosopher consulting a rule book, but a complex adaptive system. Right, given how dynamic our understanding is, we need some heuristic, still leveraging our very own dynamic understanding to navigate, to be clear about where this leads. It's not always easy and it's not always hard. We can start to derive, say, implicit meta-ethics to this initial framework by considering what you could do right now that will make what you believe to be morally necessary more easy to do. Thus, you should do it. Before we start going in that direction, can you write out this entire framework at an academic level, including anything that we missed that rounds out this story? Okay, this is too exciting. I don't want to stop. Make this as long as it needs to be. I blame Changebox for this because I wasn't totally bought in on doing the moral framework survivor thorough. Oh, let's do it. But he was excited about it, so I wanted to keep it going. Hell yeah, that was necessary. You don't even understand how much better this response is going to be than the one previously. Oh, I should have said extensively. How much of extensive implies verbose? Yeah, you know what? I think I like extensively more. Let's go back for extensively instead of thoroughly, because thoroughly kind of overlaps with comprehensively. But extensively, that can be. Problem is the stuff that the stuff that we're talking about here is so controversial. It's insane. Like, it seems so mundane when we just ground it all in science here, but it's so controversial. It's I got to be really careful about that because people will infer implications that I do not subscribe to, and that's a real problem. That's why I try to be as precise in this as possible. Okay. This text treats. Oh my God, we got an abstract. Hell yeah. Well done, Onion Helmet. We got an abstract out of it. This text treats morality not as a metaphysical object, but as a complex, emergent biological process. It integrates evolutionary history, neurocognitive mechanics, and practical agency into a single descriptive system, culminating in the meta-ethical heuristic of facilitation. This framework posits that morality is best understood as a function of allostatic regulation operating across phylogenetic, ontogenetic, and sociogenetic timescales. So evolutionary, developmental, and cultural. It rejects moral realism, the existence of objective moral facts, in favor of a pragmatic naturalism. Oh my gosh, this is another time where we got hit with the term pragmatic naturalism. Here, moral judgments are described as the output of idiosyncratic, historically contingent neural predictive models. The normative force of morality is identified not as external duty, but as the internal imperative of an agent to maintain predictive coherence and integrity. Yeah, I guess that's one way we can highlight it. And going in this direction, a lot of times, morality is caught up in people's self-identity. So to see, like, this is another sense where, you could look at when people do things that they never considered that they would be able to do, morally speaking. Like in war, you have to, kill someone. That can be traumatic because you didn't think that you were the type of person that could kill someone. And so you could consider that to be a predictive incoherence, afterwards. But yeah, like even someone who comes in here and says that they vehemently believe in objective truth external to subjective experience, the goal is for me not to say that's nonsense. We want to be respectful here about other views, because what makes our view more privileged than other people's views? I mean, once we get to morality, then we have to start making a stand about, like, even though other people have subjective views, I have to assume some sort of privilege with the fact that this is my moral experience here. So I need to do something if I see someone acting as if they understand morality incredibly differently, as if they, imagining if they're bullying someone or they're being mean-spirited in some way. All right, I think we're going to read this tomorrow. Summary: the biosocial homeostatic framework describes a world where morality is neither a fiction nor a divine law. It is the sophisticated high-level output of organisms trying to maintain stability in a complex social world. It grounds our responsibility to be good not in the stars, but in the biological necessity of being whole. Wow, that's philosophically profound. But being whole in the sense that, we want to not experience negative emotion. Like, we are, like, you could think about your morality right now as being calibrated to feel very uncomfortable when you see things that are immoral or when you hear things that are immoral. Like, when we hear about corruption, there's a certain level of, like, underlying feeling that's happening there that's affecting how we think about it and why we think it's immoral. All right, we'll read both of these fun things tomorrow, and then we're chilling.